Podcasting has never been more competitive, with millions of budding podcasters all battling it out to get to the top of the podcast charts. But if you want to leapfrog over all of them, you can't just look at the data. You need to make the data work for you, both yours and your competitors. Let's take a look at how. And we're going to be starting off with Spotify for this video, but Apple has a very similar analytics tool for their podcast service. And we'll look at the differences in a little bit later. So you're going to be logging on to your Spotify for Podcasters account, or if you haven't created one, then click sign up, enter your RSS feed, and give Spotify some info about what categories your podcast fits into. Once you're signed up, you're going to be presented with this screen, which is a broad overview on your podcast statistics. And below that will be the statistics for each individual episode on Spotify. But what's the difference between starts, streams, listeners, and followers? Well, let's take them in order. The number of starts is the number of times people have clicked on an episode. So if one user clicks on an episode 50 times, then that's 50 starts. Streams is the number of times people have clicked on an episode and actually listened to at least 1 minute of it. And already we have unlocked an incredibly vital piece of information here. Because if your starts are much higher than your streams, then that means that people are discovering your podcast episode just fine, but you're not able to capture their attention in the first 60 seconds. And then they quickly leave. So if this is you, then try shortening your intros, sharpening your hooks, and pushing back your ad reads to a little bit later in the episode. If you do all of that and the ratio of your streams starts to improve, then you'll be making the most of each and every single click and moving up the podcast ranks a lot faster. Now, as a side note here, Apple's podcast analytics tool is super similar, but it has an added bonus of letting you see if people are skipping your ad rolls. Next to streams, you're going to be seeing listeners. Now, before I explain listeners to you, you need to listen to me and like then subscribe, because I just gave you a great piece of advice there, and you're going to be getting even more in future videos. Listeners are similar to streams, but it only counts individuals. And that means that if one listener restarts an episode multiple times and listens to more than one that day, then they'll likely only count as just one listener. And that greatly relates to the last metric on this page, and that is followers. This one is pretty self-explanatory when looked at broadly, but super important when we looked at it on a per episode basis. Because broadly, this is just the people who follow your podcast, but when you examine the number of followers that each episode receives, then you get the holy grail of marketing. And that is knowing what is actually pleasing and converting your listeners. If a disproportionate number of listeners are following after a certain episode, do more of whatever it is that you did in that episode. And that could mean topic. It could mean guests, or it could even mean the general vibes that you brought to that episode. Whatever it is, pinpoint it and then do it again and again and again. Both Spotify and Apple offer individual episode performance graphs so you can actually see how well your podcast is doing. Now, before we get into how you can study other podcasters' data, there's still plenty you can sink your teeth into with Spotify. First up is impressions. Now, this one is especially important to newer podcasters or creators who are still struggling to get eyes on their episode. But now, if this isn't you, feel free to skip ahead on the timestamp here up on the screen to learn how to utilize the age and gender statistics. But now, impressions tells you how many times your podcast has been shown to users in a 30-day period. And you can actually set it for both the entire podcast or just a single episode. And if you check yours after this video and you see that you have way more impressions than streams or listeners, don't worry, we got the answers for you. The first thing you want to do is check your show page. And I mean really check it. Almost as if you were an outside observer who has never heard of your podcast before. Ask yourself questions like, is your podcast description both accurate and intriguing? Is your logo as eye-catchy as it could possibly be? Are your titles or descriptions leaving listeners on the table? These are the kinds of questions that you need to be asking yourself every few months, and that last question might just be the most important one for increasing both impressions and listeners. Because the number one way that you're going to be getting more eyes on your podcast, or ears on your podcast, for either Spotify or Apple Podcast is by your title or description appearing in the search results. So you need to include keywords that people are actually searching for and updating older relevant episode descriptions to contain these new trendy keywords. This way you can kind of boost the stats on some of your older episodes that you might have forgotten about. Now, there are a bunch of ways to find these keywords and see what people are actually searching for, from Google Trends to vidIQ to SEMrush. And we actually go more into detail on how to use these great tools in our last video here, so check that out. So now there is the audience demographics. More specifically, age and gender. Now, this one is a bit of a weird one and initially might not appear to be too important for new podcasters. I mean, after all, no two people are the same, and making broad assumptions based on certain characteristics is probably not going to go well, because it is true that by appealing to everyone, you actually appeal to no one, especially when it comes to making money. Because by understanding statistics like the genders or ages of your viewers, you can actually monetize a lot faster with things like affiliate links or even online courses. Let's say your podcast caters to DIY enthusiasts. Well, think about what they'd actually want to be buying. They're probably not going to be springing for the luxury $75 toolbox, but they might settle on a set of $15 screwdrivers. That might be right up their alley. So don't let your audience demographics affect what you say, but do let it affect what you sell. Now, while we're here, let's take a quick look at Apple's podcast analytics tools and what the differences are. Now, the sign-up process is pretty identical to Spotify's, but after you're done here, you'll be able to see your stats. Now, the phrasing here is a little different to Spotify's, with the number of devices being Apple's version of listeners. But from here on, it's pretty self-explanatory. However, Apple does offer a few different tools, like allowing you to see how many people have actually skipped over your intro and your mid-roll. Now, this is great because it allows you to pinpoint the exact moment when listeners are getting bored, and it allows you to boost retention. You can also track follower growth, which helps you see when and why new listeners start following your podcast, so you can then connect audience spikes to specific episodes or promotions, and then of course you'll just want to rinse and repeat whatever made those spikes happen as much as possible. This is a strategy that you probably already know all about if you own a business or if you're a podcaster trying to grow your business. And you can actually check out our video on exactly that right here. Now, beyond tracking followers, Apple's geographic data also shows you where your audience is tuning in from, and it can help you decide on location-focused promotions or plan live events in areas where your audience is the largest. But beyond that, Apple and Spotify stats are pretty similar here, although there are a lot more graphs and data to look at on Apple's version. Now for the part that we've all been waiting for, and that is how to study your podcast competitor stats and let them do all the hard work for you. It's time to put your detective hat on and jump to sites like Podchaser and Listen Notes. Listen Notes is great because it ranks podcasts on popularity, tells you what categories that podcast fits into on the major directories, and it provides breakdowns on popularity by countries. Listen Notes also offers powerful search features for refining podcasts based on topics, titles, episodes, and even specific quotes within each episode. Users can then browse through curated lists, explore trending shows, and use filters to narrow down their searches. It ranks podcasts on popularity, provides creators with tools like custom playlists and embeddable audio players. But we're a little bit more interested in Podchaser's charts tools, which ranks podcasts based on location and categories. Just put in your location and categories and then create a list of best or fastest growing podcasts, and then just begin studying on pen and paper here. You want to be asking yourself questions like, when do they do their ad breaks? How long are their intros? Or how do they interact with each guest? Podcasting is already so competitive and getting more so every single day. And if you're not already listening to your competitors, then you might not be making it as far as they do. So by combining the charts with some old-fashioned studying, you can figure out what's working in your niche fast. And of course, you wouldn't have any time to study up on your competition if you weren't using great tools like Podcastle, which makes recording, editing, and publishing effortless and for free, might I add. Join today to get access to a huge host of AI tools to enhance your audio and video needs with just one click, with 50% off a Podcastle Pro and a promo code in the description down below. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.